Are ARK ETFs a good idea? That's going to be the topic of today's video. Now, ARK ETFs are in a lot of new areas. They have ETFs like 3D printing and other kinds of ETFs which aren't widely available. Now, I'm not against ARK ETFs at all. In fact, I have plenty of clients who are actually in these ETFs. So they are in some interesting areas. So I do think in the long term, if you hold some of these ETFs, they will actually do fine. However, one thing I would say is I don't think they will perform particularly better or worse than other ETFs. It reminds me of people who are obsessed with going into Vanguard when iShares and BlackRock and other ETFs are just as good. In fact, they're correlated, right? If you buy the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, it's going to do pretty much the same as the iShares S&P 500 ETF. It's just a brand name. And likewise, even though ARK have gone into new areas that a lot of companies haven't gone into, of course that will change, right? I mean, I'm sure in 1 or 2 years, maybe even when some of you are watching this video, other firms would have gone into that space as well. There's always new ETFs from different firms. So I don't think they're going to particularly perform better or worse than any other firm going into that particular space. It also reminds me of when I did a video on Vanguard and indeed an article on Vanguard and compared them to DFM funds, that's Dimensional Fund Advisors, which are so-called smart beta ETFs. In other words, they don't just take the market cap, they try to kind of combine passive and active investments in one particular ETF. And I said long-term, I think they'll do pretty similar. And I think the same about ARK. I think they'll do pretty similar to Vanguard or iShares when it comes to comparable ETFs. Now, right now they are in some new spaces, but that's going to change over time. So there's nothing wrong with these ETFs at all. In fact, I think they'll do pretty well, but I wouldn't always focus on the hype surrounding these ETFs, because also remember, a lot of these ETFs are in niche areas, albeit niche areas that will grow a lot probably, like 3D printing. But never forget that holding, say, an S&P 500 ETF is always going to be a lot less risky than holding, say, a niche such as 3D printing, or for that matter, even something which is a technology fund. I mean, that's something you can go into, absolutely. But then I come back to something, and if you look at some of the niche ETFs in technology and compare them to the NASDAQ, often the NASDAQ ETF has done just as well, if not better, in many occasions. So there's nothing wrong with these ETFs, but I wouldn't necessarily just focus on them. Maybe hold them for 10% of your portfolio, 20%. Or if you want to go more than that, just hold them long term. Don't care about the volatility, because a lot of these ETFs are going to be in areas which are very volatile. There's nothing wrong with that. Volatility doesn't always mean it's riskier. But I wouldn't necessarily believe all the hype about this particular company, and indeed any other companies to go into the space. It reminds me of so-called free ETFs. For a few months, there was loads of hype about these firms offering free ETFs, no-fee ETFs. But a lot of consumers looked at it and said, well, you know, 0.1% compared to 0%, is it just marketing or whatever? Maybe it was, maybe it isn't. But the bottom line is, whether you buy an ARK ETF or a NASDAQ ETF, it's not actually going to make much of a difference long term. How can I help you? In 2 ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfayed.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.